Hey guys, tonight we're talking about all the times medieval humanity came this close to deleting itself, not because of meteors or monsters, but because of deeply confident bad decisions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If medieval medicine had a customer satisfaction survey, the results would have been difficult to interpret, mostly because the customers were no longer alive. The core medical philosophy of the Middle Ages was beautifully simple. If something is wrong inside the body, remove fluids until either balance is restored or the patient stops complaining permanently. This approach was called bloodletting, and it was the medieval equivalent of turning off your computer by throwing it out a window, effective in one very specific sense. Doctors believed the human body was ruled by 4 humours, and sickness meant one of them was misbehaving. Which one? That was less important. The cure, regardless of symptoms, was almost always bloodletting. Fever, bloodletting. Infection, bloodletting. Cough, bloodletting. Feeling a bit sad? Bloodletting, just to stay ahead of things. The reasoning went something like this. Sick people are weak, therefore they clearly have too much blood. Remove it, preferably quickly. The process itself was not gentle. Veins were opened with knives, sometimes repeatedly. Leeches were applied and left to do what leeches do best: silently judge your life choices while draining you. Patients were often bled until they fainted, which doctors interpreted as the treatment is working. Unconsciousness was considered a promising sign. Even better, bloodletting wasn't optional. It was mainstream medicine. Refusing it didn't make you cautious. It made you non-compliant, which in medieval terms meant everyone quietly agreed your death was your own fault. Doctors who didn't bleed patients were viewed as suspicious. After all, how could someone be cured if they still had all their blood? During epidemics, this practice went from questionable to catastrophic. People already suffering from hunger, cold, dehydration, and infection were relieved of the very substance keeping their organs functioning. Immune systems collapsed. Recovery became a rumor. The truly impressive part is that medieval doctors often doubled down. If the patient worsened, that simply meant not enough blood had been removed. The solution to a failing treatment was more treatment. From a modern perspective, this looks like a slow-motion disaster. From a medieval perspective, it was careful, responsible medicine. And that's the terrifying part. Humanity didn't just fight disease. It politely escorted it inside, gave it a knife, and said, "Please, take your time." And somehow, against every medical instinct, people survived long enough to stop doing this. Once medieval medicine had finished bleeding people into the afterlife, medieval dietary advice stepped in to make sure anyone left standing didn't recover too comfortably. Because when you're already starving, cold, and diseased, the logical next step is to avoid the few foods that might actually help you survive. During famines and outbreaks, medieval authorities warned people against eating fruits and vegetables. Not because they were spoiled, but because they were considered too moist. Moist foods, according to medical theory, corrupted the humours. This was taken very seriously. Apples were suspicious. Greens were dangerous. Fresh food, in general, was viewed as a kind of dietary criminal. Instead, people were encouraged to eat heavy, dry foods: meat, stale bread, thick porridge, and wine. This advice was excellent if you were a well-fed noble with a stocked cellar. For everyone else, it was essentially a starvation strategy with religious backing. The problem, of course, was availability. During a famine, meat was rare, bread was rationed, and wine was expensive. Fruits and vegetables were often the only things people could find. But eating them felt like gambling with your soul. So peasants made the responsible choice and continued not eating. And when they did eat, digestion was a nightmare. Heavy foods required energy to process. energy-sick and starving bodies did not have. People weakened further, their immune systems quietly packing up and leaving town without notice. Medical authorities noticed people getting worse and came to a reasonable conclusion. The diet was not strict enough. Some doctors advised avoiding food almost entirely during illness because digestion supposedly distracted the body from healing. This meant that during disease outbreaks, people responded by eating less. Much less. Sometimes nothing. Children suffered the most. Growing bodies deprived of nutrition stopped growing, then stopped fighting infection, then stopped entirely. Entire generations were thinned not by the famine itself, but by the instructions on how to behave during it. And just to make things worse, hunger was often framed as spiritually beneficial. If you were starving, it meant God was testing you. If you died, it meant the test had concluded. From a modern perspective, this is baffling. From a medieval perspective, it was responsible self-control. Humanity didn't just face food shortages, it added rules, fear, and moral pressure to them, and nearly starved itself out of existence. Politely, obediently, and with remarkable discipline. Medieval people had many impressive skills: farming without machinery, building cathedrals without calculators, surviving winters that wanted them dead. What they did not have was a working concept of water hygiene, and this oversight nearly erased entire cities. In medieval towns, waste management followed a simple, optimistic principle: not our problem once it leaves the house. Human waste, animal waste, food scraps, and anything unpleasant were tossed into the street, dumped into open pits, or politely encouraged toward the nearest river. Rivers, in turn, were assumed to possess magical cleansing powers. If something went into the water upstream, it was clearly gone forever by the time it reached you. Science. Unfortunately, rivers did not share this belief. Medieval cities often built latrines directly over waterways. Entire neighborhoods flushed themselves into the same rivers they later used for drinking, washing, and brewing beer. If you ever wondered why medieval ale was so popular, it's because fermented liquid was statistically safer than water that had recently hosted a parade of human regrets. The result was predictable. One sick person upstream meant everyone downstream was participating in a communal biology experiment. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne illnesses spread with ease. Cities became self-sustaining disease machines, proudly recycling their own problems. And when outbreaks happened, no one suspected the water. Why would they? Water looked clean. It tasted fine. It wasn't visibly screaming, "I am poison." Instead, blame went elsewhere. Bad air, sinful behavior, foreign influence, or the moon doing something suspicious again. People responded by burning incense, ringing church bells, or fleeing the city, often carrying the disease with them. The water remained untouched, unquestioned, and enthusiastically contaminated. Even attempts at cleanliness made things worse. Washing clothes in rivers added more waste. Slaughterhouses drained directly into streams. Tanners soaked animal hides in water that later flowed into wells. It was an ecosystem of poor decisions working together in perfect harmony. The truly astonishing part is that medieval cities knew something was wrong. People noticed patterns. Sickness followed certain water sources. Entire neighborhoods suffered repeatedly, and yet, without germ theory, the conclusion was never, "stop drinking that water." It was, "something unseen is angry." From a modern perspective, medieval sanitation looks horrifying. From a medieval perspective, it was logical, traditional, and extremely unfortunate. Humanity didn't just poison itself. It did it efficiently, cooperatively, and every single day, one cup at a time. When disease struck medieval Europe, people desperately searched for a cause. Unfortunately, instead of discovering bacteria, they discovered vibes. And the vibes were bad. Very bad. Clearly something was to blame. And medieval society decided that something was cats. Cats, you see, had a public relations problem. They were quiet, independent, active at night, and occasionally stared into corners like they knew something you didn't. This made them suspicious. During times of plague, Suspicion was enough to earn a death sentence. Cats were associated with witches, demons, heresy, and general moral failure, none of which, unfortunately, are known carriers of disease. So medieval communities began killing them. A lot of them. This decision was made with confidence. If cats were evil, and evil caused disease, then fewer cats meant less disease. This is what passed for epidemiology. Unfortunately, cats were also the main predators of rats. And rats, as it turns out, were deeply involved in the entire plague situation. With cats gone, rat populations exploded. Rats moved freely through homes, grain stores, streets, and sleeping areas, like they had just received a written invitation. Fleas followed. Fleas thrived, and the plague spread faster than ever. At no point did medieval society pause and say, "Interesting, ever since we removed the animals that kill rats, there seem to be more rats." That would have required observation, humility, and admitting a mistake. 3 things medieval crisis management actively avoided. Instead, the worsening plague was taken as proof that not enough cats had been eliminated, so the solution was escalated. More cats were killed. Sometimes dogs too, just in case. Anything furry and vaguely suspicious became a target. This was not limited to one region. Entire towns participated. Cats were burned, drowned, chased away, or destroyed in public displays meant to cleanse the community spiritually. The rats watched quietly from the shadows, deeply appreciative of the new housing opportunities. The irony is painful. One of humanity's oldest allies, an animal that had lived alongside humans for thousands of years, was removed at the exact moment it was needed most. Not because it failed, but because it was misunderstood. From a modern perspective, this looks like tragic comedy. From a medieval perspective, it was righteous action. Humanity didn't just fight disease poorly. It fired the one employee who was actually helping, and promoted the rats instead. When medieval people realized disease wasn't responding to bloodletting, starvation, or cat elimination, they escalated to a bold new strategy: public self-harm combined with long-distance travel. This was known as the flagellant movement, and it may be one of history's most efficient examples of good intentions doing maximum damage. Flagellants believed plague was divine punishment. The solution, therefore, was to impress God with suffering. Groups of men gathered, stripped down to the waist, and marched from town to town, whipping themselves with chains, leather straps, and occasionally enthusiasm. The logic was simple. If God saw enough blood, he would stop the plague. This logic had already failed in hospitals, but hope springs eternal. These processions were not quiet. They were loud, dramatic, and highly contagious, spiritually and biologically. Flagellants sang hymns, drew crowds, and moved directly through densely populated towns. Sick people joined, healthy people joined. Everyone stood close together, breathing deeply, sharing air, sweat, and absolutely everything else. The result was predictable. Wherever the flagellants went, plague followed. Towns that had not yet been affected suddenly found themselves hosting a travelling festival of infection. Instead of isolating disease, medieval society turned it into a touring performance. Authorities occasionally tried to stop them. Some church leaders noticed that whipping yourself while spreading death was not, in fact, working. But by then, the movement had momentum. Flagellants didn't trust doctors, priests, or officials. They trusted pain. Pain felt productive. Pain felt meaningful. Pain looked like action. And so they marched on. The psychological appeal was strong. When everything feels out of control, doing something feels better than doing nothing, even if that something is objectively worse. The flagellants gave people purpose, certainty, and a sense of moral superiority, all while unknowingly accelerating population collapse. From a modern perspective, it's horrifying. From a medieval perspective, it was devotion in motion. Humanity didn't just fail to contain disease. It organized it, scheduled it, and sent it on tour. And somehow, miraculously, people still survived long enough to eventually stop doing this. Medieval cities were marvels of human achievement. Towering walls, bustling markets, narrow streets filled with life, commerce, and, unfortunately, everyone's bodily fluids. If disease were looking for ideal living conditions, medieval urban planning would have won an award. Cities grew fast and vertically, but not intelligently. Houses were packed together so tightly that neighbours could borrow salt through the window. Streets were narrow, dark, and designed more for shadow than sunlight. Fresh air was considered optional. Ventilation was a rumour. People lived on top of each other because land inside city walls was valuable. The solution was simple: stack humans like firewood. Multiple families shared single buildings. Animals lived indoors. Chickens wandered through kitchens. Pigs strolled the streets like they owned the place, which, frankly, they kind of did. Waste management followed the same philosophy as everything else: minimal effort, maximum optimism. Refuse was tossed into the street. Chamber pots were emptied out windows with a polite warning if you were lucky. Rain occasionally washed things away, which was considered a complete sanitation plan. When disease entered this environment, it didn't spread. It exploded. Close living meant constant contact. One cough reached 10 people. One fever meant a household outbreak. One infected rat meant an entire block was negotiating with death by the end of the week. Isolation was nearly impossible. Quarantine meant sleeping 6 inches farther away from the person coughing directly into your face. And yet, medieval cities believed density was safety. Walls kept enemies out. Crowds meant protection. The idea that humans themselves could be the threat was uncomfortable. Much easier to blame air, stars, or moral decay than admit that living inside a human beehive might have consequences. Even worse, cities attracted people during crises. When famine or war struck the countryside, peasants flooded into cities seeking food and work. Instead, they found overcrowding, disease, and a fast-track introduction to urban mortality. From the outside, medieval cities looked impressive. From the inside, they functioned like slow-moving incubators. Humanity didn't just suffer from disease, it lovingly constructed the perfect environment for it. Brick by brick, wall by wall, person by person. And still, cities grew, because despite everything, people preferred dying together inside walls than alone outside them. Once medieval society accepted that disease wasn't politely staying inside city walls, it needed something to blame. Unfortunately, germs were invisible, and medieval people did not trust invisible things unless they were angels, demons, or deeply judgmental saints. So instead of fighting disease, they fought people. When plague struck, logic packed its bags and left town. Fear took over, and fear demanded a target. Witches, heretics, foreigners, beggars, healers, midwives, and anyone slightly unusual suddenly became suspicious. If you lived alone, knew herbs, spoke differently, or had a cat before Chapter 4 happened to it, congratulations, you are now a public health threat. Entire communities became convinced that burning the wrong people would somehow disinfect reality itself. Fires were lit, trials were rushed, evidence was optional. Confessions were encouraged with enthusiasm. The logic was simple. If we destroy the source of evil, the sickness will stop. The plague, unfortunately, did not attend these meetings. This strategy had several drawbacks. First, it removed people who were often useful. Midwives and healers were targeted precisely because they were present during illness. Killing them reduced care, not disease. Second, executions created crowds. Large, tightly packed, emotionally charged crowds. Exactly the environment disease preferred. Third, persecution caused panic. People fled towns to avoid accusations, carrying disease with them into new regions. Others hid symptoms, afraid that coughing too loudly might earn them a trial. Silence replaced honesty, and illness spread quietly behind closed doors. Worst of all, this approach created a dangerous feedback loop. When disease worsened, it proved guilt had not been punished enough. So more people were accused, more fires were lit, more communities destabilized themselves in the middle of an epidemic. From a modern perspective, this looks monstrous. From a medieval perspective, it looked like action. It felt righteous. It gave people the illusion of control in a world where everything else was collapsing. Humanity didn't just misunderstand disease. It declared war on imaginary enemies, and in the process, helped extinction along quite efficiently. The plague didn't need to fight humans. Humans did most of the work themselves. When medieval medicine wasn't busy removing blood or banning vegetables, it turned to its next great idea: poison. Not accidental poison, intentional, measured, doctor-approved poison. Because if disease was strong, the cure clearly needed to be stronger, ideally lethal, but in a controlled way. Medieval pharmacies were less healing centres and more experimental hazards. Remedies included mercury, arsenic, lead, sulphur, and various mysterious powders scraped from rocks that had never helped anyone, ever. These substances were believed to purge illness from the body by forcing it out violently. Vomiting, sweating, diarrhea, all excellent signs. If you felt worse, the medicine was working. Mercury was especially popular. It was shiny, mysterious, and deeply toxic. 3 qualities medieval people found very convincing. Doctors prescribed it for skin diseases, parasites, and general bad vibes. Patients who survived the illness often didn't survive the cure. Those who did were rewarded with nerve damage, madness, and a shortened life expectancy. A win by medieval standards. Lead was everywhere. Pipes, plates, cups, cookware, cosmetics, even medicine. Wine was sometimes sweetened with lead compounds, which gave it a pleasant taste and slowly poisoned anyone who enjoyed it regularly. Entire communities suffered chronic lead poisoning without realizing it, mistaking the symptoms for divine punishment or melancholy. Arsenic had a dual career as both medicine and murder weapon. In tiny doses, it was believed to restore balance. In slightly larger doses, it restored silence. Unfortunately, medieval measurement tools were not precise, and the difference between healing and fatal was often a strong guess and a prayer. What made this especially dangerous was trust. These substances were prescribed by authority figures. Doctors, monks, scholars, people trained, respected, and absolutely confident. Patients didn't question them. After all, refusing medicine was irresponsible. If you died, it meant the disease was stronger than the cure. No one considered the alternative explanation. During epidemics, poison treatments multiplied. Desperate people swallowed anything recommended. If one remedy failed, doctors tried another, often stacking poisons on top of poisons, turning sickbeds into chemistry experiments with no safety guidelines. From a modern perspective, this is horrifying. From a medieval perspective, it was cutting-edge science. Humanity didn't just fight disease blindly, it fought it with toxins, and congratulated itself for being proactive. At a certain point during medieval epidemics, death simply outpaced organization. People didn't stop dying, they just stopped being dealt with properly. And when a society can't keep up with its dead, things get unpleasant very quickly. During major outbreaks, bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Graveyards filled, churches overflowed, coffins became optional. Eventually, corpses were stacked in homes, streets, and public spaces, like unwanted furniture no one knew where to put. This was not a sign of disrespect. It was a sign of exhaustion. Normally, burial involved ritual, care, and distance from the living. During epidemics, that distance vanished. Families kept dead relatives indoors for days, sometimes longer, waiting for priests, grave diggers, or anyone brave enough to help. The air inside homes grew heavy. The smell announced that something had gone very wrong with the concept of indoors. Mass graves were the emergency solution. Trenches were dug hastily, often near towns, rivers, or wells, because digging far away required time, energy, and optimism, all of which were in short supply. Bodies were layered quickly, covered thinly, and forgotten out of necessity rather than neglect. This created a problem medieval people did not understand but absolutely experienced: Decay contaminated water sources. Insects flourished, animals dug. Rain carried everything downhill. Disease didn't just spread, it soaked back into daily life like a terrible memory that refused to leave. Ironically, fear of the dead made things worse. People believed corpses carried spiritual danger, so they avoided touching them. This delayed burials even further. The dead became untouchable, while the living continued sharing the same spaces, breathing the same air, drinking the same water. In some towns, carts were sent through streets to collect bodies. The call was simple and efficient. Bring out your dead. People complied quietly, because arguing required energy they didn't have. Death became routine, familiar, almost administrative. And yet, despite all of this, the response was rarely, "We need to change how we handle this." It was more often, "This is horrible, therefore it must be inevitable." From a modern perspective, leaving corpses among the living looks catastrophic. From a medieval perspective, it was unavoidable. No one had the systems, the manpower, or the knowledge to do better. Not yet. Humanity didn't just struggle against death, it lived beside it, slept near it, and slowly learned the hard way that ignoring decay does not make it go away. At some point, medieval people noticed a troubling pattern. When someone got sick, everyone around them soon followed. This observation was correct. The conclusion they drew from it, however, was complicated. Isolation felt cruel, unchristian, borderline suspicious. If someone was ill, the moral response was not distance, it was closeness. Family members gathered around the sickbed, friends visited, neighbours stopped by to offer prayers, advice, and germs. Leaving someone alone during illness felt like abandonment, and medieval society took abandonment very seriously. So instead of isolating the sick, people did the opposite. They crowded in. Entire households slept in the same room, often the same bed. Sick children were held constantly. Dying parents were surrounded by relatives. This wasn't negligence, it was love. Unfortunately, disease does not respect love. Disease sees love and thinks, excellent. More hosts. Medical advice didn't help. Doctors rarely recommended separation. In fact, some believed fresh company lifted the spirits and therefore improved recovery. Which may be emotionally true, but biologically disastrous. A single infected person could quietly pass illness to an entire household within days. Even worse, medieval homes were small, poorly ventilated, and filled with smoke. Windows were tiny or non-existent. Fires burned constantly. Air barely moved. If disease wanted to linger, medieval cottages offered premium accommodations. Quarantine as a concept did exist. Sort of. Some cities experimented with isolating ships or travellers, but these measures were inconsistent and often ignored. Merchants argued, clergy protested, people snuck in and out, rules collapsed the moment they became inconvenient. And then there was fear. People worried that isolating the sick might anger God, who had clearly sent illness for a reason. If disease was punishment, separating from it might look like avoidance, and avoidance might invite worse punishment later. Better to endure together than offend divine authority. From a modern perspective, this is painful to watch. From a medieval perspective, it was compassionate behaviour. Society chose emotional unity over biological survival, without realising it was making the worst possible trade. Humanity didn't just fail to contain illness, it embraced it, held its hand, and whispered, "We'll get through this together." Which they did, just not all of them. Even when medieval people weren't actively starving themselves on medical advice, they were still quietly losing the long game against nutrition. For most of the population, hunger wasn't a crisis, it was a background feature, a constant hum of not quite enough, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. The average medieval diet was repetitive, seasonal, and aggressively beige. Bread formed the foundation of life. If you were lucky, it was fresh. If you were not, It was hard enough to qualify as a building material. Vegetables came and went with the seasons. Meat was rare, saved for special occasions, holidays, or moments when an animal died inconveniently and had to be eaten quickly. This meant that most people lived in a permanent state of nutritional deficiency. They were not starving dramatically. They were starving slowly, quietly, politely. The kind of hunger that doesn't kill you outright. It just makes you weaker, shorter, sicker, and far less capable of surviving the next disaster. Children grew up underfed. Their bodies adapted by growing less. Shorter stature, weaker bones, and compromised immune systems became normal. Adults carried those deficits into adulthood, where a minor infection could become fatal simply because the body had no reserves left to fight with. Then came the bad years. Crop failure, harsh winters, war, floods. Famine didn't arrive alone. It arrived on top of an already weakened population. People who had survived decades of almost enough suddenly faced definitely not enough. And bodies that had been running on empty had nothing left to give. Ironically, the social response often made things worse. During shortages, people hoarded, markets collapsed, prices spiked. The poor were priced out of survival while watching food exist just out of reach. Malnutrition turned into mass death, not because food didn't exist, but because access did not. And through it all, hunger was normalized. People didn't complain much. Complaining implied expectation, and expectation implied entitlement. Hunger was framed as moral discipline, spiritual testing, or simply the natural order of things. From a modern perspective, this looks like systemic failure. From a medieval perspective, it was life as designed. Humanity didn't just face famine. It lived perpetually one bad harvest away from collapse, and somehow survived, thin, tired, and astonishingly resilient. If disease and hunger didn't finish the job, medieval warfare was always waiting patiently in the background, sharpening a sword and burning a village just to stay busy. War in the Middle Ages was not a brief interruption of peace. It was a lifestyle, a recurring subscription humanity never managed to cancel. Medieval wars rarely ended cleanly. Armies didn't fight one decisive battle and politely go home. They marched back and forth across the same countryside for years, sometimes decades, destroying the exact resources civilians needed to survive. Crops were trampled or burned, wells were poisoned, livestock was stolen or slaughtered. The goal wasn't just to defeat the enemy, it was to make the land itself unlivable. For peasants, this meant famine on demand. You could survive disease one year, hunger the next, and then wake up to find soldiers politely turning your entire livelihood into ashes because your village happened to exist between two arguing nobles. Armies were also excellent disease delivery systems. Soldiers lived in close quarters, travelled constantly, and brought sickness wherever they went. When they passed through towns, they didn't just take food and shelter. They left behind infections. War didn't pause plagues. It distributed them. Civilians fled violence into forests or cities, creating overcrowding wherever they went. Refugees packed into already struggling towns, pushing sanitation and food systems past collapse. Cities became pressure cookers of hunger, fear, and disease, while the countryside lay ruined. And when wars finally paused, the damage didn't magically disappear. Fields took years to recover. Seed grain had been eaten. Tools were gone. Skilled labourers were dead. Even peace was exhausting. What made this especially dangerous was frequency. Medieval people didn't experience one war per generation. They experienced several. Border conflicts, succession wars, feuds, crusades. Conflict was constant enough that recovery often never fully happened before the next disaster arrived. From a modern perspective, this looks like systemic madness. From a medieval perspective, it was normal politics. Humanity didn't just suffer war, it normalized it, built systems around it, and then wondered why populations kept collapsing. That medieval people survived it all is less a testament to strategy, and more a testament to sheer stubborn refusal to disappear. Medieval homes were warm, smoky, and deeply committed to damaging your lungs. Fire was essential for survival, but medieval architecture treated smoke like a mild suggestion rather than a lethal problem. Chimneys were optional, ventilation was theoretical, and fresh air was something you experienced briefly while going outside to fetch water and question your life choices. Most peasant homes had an open hearth in the centre of the room. The smoke from this fire did not exit efficiently. Instead, it lingered. It curled around rafters, sank back down, and filled living spaces with a thick haze that made your eyes water and your throat feel like it had personally offended the fire. This was not considered dangerous. This was considered cozy. People lived, slept, cooked, and worked in this environment every day. Children grew up breathing smoke the way modern people breathe city air. Coughing was normal. Burning eyes were normal. Headaches were normal. If you couldn't see clearly across the room, that just meant the fire was doing its job. Over time, this constant exposure took a toll. Chronic respiratory problems were widespread. Lungs weakened. Immune systems suffered. When epidemics arrived, these damaged lungs became perfect entry points for illness. What might have been survivable in a healthier body became fatal in one already struggling to breathe. Ironically, smoke was also believed to be protective. Some people thought it purified the air or drove away evil influences. So when disease appeared, the solution was sometimes more smoke, extra fires, more incense, less oxygen. If the plague didn't get you, the atmosphere might. And remember, homes were small. Entire families slept in the same room, sometimes the same bed, wrapped in blankets saturated with smoke. Night after night, lungs absorbed particles that modern doctors would describe with words like extremely concerning. From a modern perspective, medieval indoor living looks like a public health disaster. From a medieval perspective, it was survival. Cold killed faster than smoke, at least in the short term. The long-term consequences were someone else's problem, usually future you. Humanity didn't just warm itself, it slowly smoked itself, and then wondered why breathing felt optional during epidemics. The miracle isn't that medieval people suffered from respiratory illness. The miracle is that they survived long enough to eventually invent chimneys that actually worked. One of the most dangerous things medieval people ever did wasn't burning cats, drinking sewage, or bleeding patients until they fainted. It was something far quieter and far more persistent. They trusted tradition more than evidence. And tradition, unfortunately, had a very impressive body count. In medieval society, knowledge wasn't something you tested, it was something you inherited. If an idea was old, it was correct. If it came from an authority figure, it was unquestionable. And if it had killed people before, that was clearly unrelated and probably God's fault. Medical texts were copied word for centuries, even when their advice consistently failed. Bloodletting worked because Galen said it worked. Dietary restrictions mattered because Aristotle had opinions. Questioning these figures wasn't curiosity, it was arrogance. And arrogance, everyone knew, was much more dangerous than dying of preventable illness. Observation did happen. People noticed patterns all the time. They saw that certain treatments made patients worse. They noticed that some towns got sick more often than others. They realized that certain water sources caused problems. But observation without permission meant nothing. If what you saw contradicted tradition, tradition won. And tradition always won. A healer who suggested something new risked ridicule, punishment, or accusations of heresy. A doctor who ignored accepted methods could lose status or livelihood. Even being right didn't protect you. In fact, being right too early was suspicious. Why were you questioning wisdom passed down for generations? What were you hiding? This created a world where deadly ideas survived longer than people. Practices that harmed patients continued simply because they had always been done. Progress moved at the speed of copying manuscripts by candlelight, and only if the copyist approved of the idea. The truly dangerous part was confidence. Medieval society wasn't uncertain. It was deeply sure of itself. It believed it understood the world, illness, and God's intentions. and that certainty delayed improvement far longer than ignorance ever could have. From a modern perspective, this looks like stubbornness. From a medieval perspective, it was respect. Respect for elders, for tradition, for authority, even when that authority was quietly leading everyone toward extinction. Humanity didn't just struggle against nature. It handcuffed itself to old ideas and refused to let go, even as the cost became painfully obvious. By the end of it all, the most astonishing thing about medieval humanity is not how close it came to extinction, it's that it didn't actually manage to pull it off. Given the bloodletting, starvation, poisoned medicine, sewage drinking, cat extermination, plague parades, crowded cities, endless wars, smoky lungs, and unwavering loyalty to terrible ideas, survival should not have been on the table. And yet, here we are. Medieval people didn't survive because their systems worked. They survived because humans are remarkably stubborn creatures who keep reproducing even when everything else is going wrong. Survival wasn't engineered. It wasn't planned. It happened in the cracks between disasters, in the pauses between bad decisions, in moments where someone accidentally did the right thing for the wrong reason. Progress came slowly, and usually by accident. Someone noticed that isolating the sick sometimes helped. Someone realized certain water sources made people ill. Someone stopped bleeding patients because too many died immediately afterward. These changes didn't arrive as revolutions. They crept in quietly, often without explanation, long before theory caught up. What truly saved medieval people wasn't intelligence. It was adaptation under pressure. When a practice became so deadly that it threatened entire communities, it eventually softened, shifted, or quietly disappeared. Not because society admitted it was wrong, but because continuing it became impossible to ignore. And even then, change was resisted every step of the way. The Middle Ages were not a story of ignorance versus enlightenment. They were a story of humans trapped inside belief systems that once made sense, slowly realizing those systems were killing them, and then arguing about it for several centuries. From a modern perspective, it's easy to laugh. From a historical perspective, it's sobering, because medieval people weren't uniquely foolish. They were doing what humans always do, trusting what feels familiar, obeying authority, clinging to explanations that offer comfort, and avoiding uncertainty at all costs. They almost went extinct, not because they were weak, but because changing how you think is harder than surviving another bad year. In the end, humanity didn't escape the Middle Ages by brilliance alone. It escaped by surviving long enough to question itself. And honestly, that's still how it works today. At the very centre of Norse belief stood Yggdrasil, not as a symbol, but as the literal structure holding existence together. To the Vikings, the cosmos was not an abstract void of stars and emptiness. It was a living system, organic and fragile, bound together by a colossal ash tree whose roots and branches touched every corner of reality. If Yggdrasil failed, everything failed with it. The tree rose from the depths of existence, its trunk impossibly vast, its bark weathered by ages older than memory, its branches stretched outward and upward, cradling worlds like fruit on a limb. These branches were said to creak and groan, not from wind, but from the weight of fate itself. The Vikings imagined the universe as something that could be heard, strained, and slowly worn down over time. Yggdrasil was not serene or benevolent. It was constantly under attack. Serpents gnawed at its roots. A dragon chewed endlessly at its base. Deer stripped its leaves. Decay was not an accident. It was built into the system. The Vikings believed that existence was never stable, never safe, and never eternal. Even the structure holding the cosmos together was slowly dying. At the base of Yggdrasil lay sacred wells, each tied to a fundamental force of reality. One was the well of wisdom, guarded fiercely and paid for in sacrifice. Another was the well of fate, where the destinies of gods and men alike were carved into existence. These waters fed the tree, but they also reminded the gods that knowledge and destiny came at a cost. Importantly, Yggdrasil did not separate gods from humans or the living from the dead. All were connected through the same structure. The Vikings saw themselves not as spectators in the universe, but as participants standing on one of Yggdrasil's branches. Their lives mattered, but not because they were protected, because they were exposed. This worldview shaped everything. If the cosmos itself was fragile, then struggle was natural. If even the gods could not stop decay, then courage mattered more than survival. Yggdrasil taught the Vikings that existence was temporary, interconnected, and constantly threatened, and that meaning came not from permanence, but from how one endured while the tree still stood. From the branches and roots of Yggdrasil emerged the 9 worlds, each one a complete reality of its own, yet never fully separate from the others. To the Vikings, the universe was not layered neatly or arranged logically. It was tangled, overlapping, and sometimes leaking into itself, much like the tree that held it all together. Closest to the gods was Asgard, a fortified world of halls, feasts, and endless preparation for war. This was not a paradise of peace, but a stronghold. Even the gods lived behind walls, knowing that enemies would one day come for them. Asgard existed high among Yggdrasil's branches, but height did not mean safety. It meant responsibility. Below it lay Midgard, the world of humanity. Midgard was not central because humans were important. It was central because humans were vulnerable. Surrounded by oceans and encircled by a massive serpent, Midgard was exposed to chaos on all sides. The Vikings believed their world was constantly under threat, balanced between order and destruction, never fully secure. Beyond Midgard were harsher realms. Jotunheim was a land of giants, ancient beings who embodied chaos, raw nature, and unstoppable forces. Giants were not evil in a moral sense, they were inevitable. Storms, winters, earthquakes, and famine all belonged to their domain. Conflict between gods and giants was not about good versus evil, but control versus collapse. Far below, wrapped around the roots of the tree, lay darker worlds. Niflheim was cold, silent, and lifeless, while hell received those who died without glory. Death was not punishment here. It was simply another destination, another branch on the tree. Crucially, these worlds were not sealed off. Gods walked into human lands. Giants invaded divine halls. Monsters crossed boundaries when balance failed. The Vikings believed reality was porous, always at risk of being breached. Living within the 9 worlds meant accepting uncertainty. You were never isolated. You were part of a system that could shift, crack, or collapse at any moment. The 9 worlds taught the Vikings that existence was interconnected, and that no realm, not even the gods, stood alone. At the heart of the Viking cosmos stood Odin, not as a gentle father god, but as a restless seeker who ruled through knowledge, sacrifice, and fear. To the Norse, wisdom was not something given freely. It had to be taken, stolen, or paid for in pain. Odin understood this better than anyone, because he paid more than all others combined. Odin was obsessed with knowing how the universe worked, and, more importantly, how it would end. He did not seek comfort or reassurance. He sought truth, even when that truth promised destruction. This obsession drove him to acts no other god would dare. He gave up one of his eyes at the Well of Wisdom, sacrificing part of his sight in exchange for deeper understanding. From that moment on, Odin saw less of the world, but understood far more of it. Yet even that was not enough. Odin went further, hanging himself from Yggdrasil itself, pierced by his own spear, denying himself food and water. For 9 days and 9 nights, he suffered between life and death, not as a martyr, but as a hunter, trapping knowledge. From this ordeal, he gained the runes, symbols of power, fate, and magic that governed reality. The message was clear. Wisdom is born from suffering, not comfort. Odin's rule reflected this philosophy. He did not promise safety to gods or humans. He promised preparation. He sent his ravens across the worlds to gather information. He filled Valhalla not with the innocent, but with the violent and the brave, warriors who could fight when the end came. Even death, under Odin's watch, became a recruitment tool. Importantly, Odin was not all-knowing. He knew Ragnarok would come, but not how to stop it. His wisdom revealed limits, not solutions. This made him deeply tragic. The most knowledgeable being in the cosmos was also the one most aware of inevitable failure. To the Vikings, Odin embodied a harsh truth about existence. Understanding does not save you. It only prepares you. The universe was not built to reward goodness or punish evil. It rewarded awareness, courage, and endurance. By worshipping Odin, the Vikings accepted a worldview where pain had purpose, sacrifice had meaning, and ignorance was the greatest weakness. Odin did not offer peace. He offered clarity, and in a universe balanced on the edge of destruction, clarity was the most valuable thing of all. In Norse mythology, the cosmos was not held together by harmony, but by tension. The gods themselves existed in a permanent state of conflict, especially with the giants, ancient beings who represented chaos, wilderness, and forces beyond control. This struggle was not a moral battle between good and evil. It was a structural necessity. Without conflict, the universe would collapse. The gods of Asgard were not immortal, perfect beings. They aged, they feared death, and they relied on constant effort to maintain order. Among them stood Thor, the blunt force of the cosmos. Where Odin sought knowledge, Thor delivered violence. His hammer was not a symbol of justice, but of containment. Each time he crushed a giant, he was not winning a war. He was delaying disaster. Thunder, storms, and earthquakes were seen as echoes of this endless struggle spilling into the human world. Opposite the gods stood the giants, beings older than Asgard itself. They were not villains plotting domination. They were nature unbound. Cold winters, raging seas, wild forests, and hunger all belonged to them. The giants existed to push against order, to test it, weaken it, and eventually break it. The Vikings understood that chaos could not be destroyed, only resisted. Between these forces moved Loki, a figure who embodied instability itself. Loki was not loyal nor purely hostile. He was contradiction. Sometimes he saved the gods, other times he doomed them. His cleverness created solutions, but his arrogance planted the seeds of catastrophe. To the Vikings, Loki represented the danger of intelligence without restraint, the kind of cleverness that solves one problem while creating 10 more. This constant friction shaped the universe. Peace was temporary. Victories were brief. Every feast in Asgard existed because another battle was coming. The gods knew this. That is why they never sought to eliminate their enemies entirely. Total victory would mean stagnation, and stagnation meant decay. For the Vikings, this cosmic conflict mirrored real life. Storms ruined crops. Winters killed livestock. War was inevitable. Survival depended on strength, adaptability, and readiness, not hope for lasting peace. The universe, as they believed it, was a battlefield in slow motion. Order and chaos pushed against each other endlessly, and existence survived only in the narrow space between them. Above gods, giants, and humans alike ruled a force even the strongest could not challenge: fate. The Vikings believed that everything, every birth, battle, and death, was already woven into existence. This power was embodied by the Norns, 3 ancient beings who lived at the roots of Yggdrasil, quietly shaping reality itself. The Norns were not gods, and they were not evil. They simply were. One shaped what had already happened, another shaped what was unfolding, and the third shaped what was yet to come. Together, they carved destinies not only for humans, but for the gods themselves. Even Odin, with all his sacrifice and knowledge, could not rewrite what the Norns had decided. He could see fate approaching, but he could never stop it. This belief made Norse mythology brutally honest. There was no illusion of escape. Death was not a punishment for failure, nor was survival a reward for virtue. You lived exactly as long as you were meant to live. What mattered was not how long your thread lasted, but how tightly it was woven. This is why courage mattered so deeply to the Vikings. If the ending was fixed, then fear was pointless. Running from fate did nothing but waste the time you were given. Facing it directly, weapon in hand, gave meaning to existence. A warrior who died screaming was pitied. A warrior who died standing was remembered. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Viking view of death itself. Those who fell bravely in battle were carried to Valhalla, not to rest, but to prepare. Every day they fought, bled, and died again, only to feast and rise once more. Valhalla was not paradise. It was training for the final catastrophe. Fate, in Norse belief, did not exist to be avoided. It existed to be met properly. Even the gods knew how the story would end. They knew betrayal was coming. They knew monsters would break free. They knew the cosmos would burn. And yet they prepared anyway. This worldview taught the Vikings something rare and unsettling. Meaning does not come from winning. It comes from standing firm when defeat is certain, and choosing to face the end without flinching. All of Norse cosmology bent toward a single, unavoidable event, Ragnarok. This was not a surprise ending or a sudden catastrophe. Ragnarok was embedded into creation itself from the very beginning. The Vikings believed the universe was born with an expiration date, and every age, every war, and every omen was a slow step toward that final collapse. Ragnarok was not triggered by one mistake or one act of evil. It began with imbalance. Bonds weakened, promises broke, natural order frayed, winters grew longer and crueler, brothers turned on brothers. The world did not end in fire alone, it ended in moral decay. To the Vikings, social collapse and cosmic collapse were reflections of the same process. As Ragnarok approached, the monsters long restrained by the gods would finally break free. Fenrir, the monstrous wolf bound by trickery, would snap his chains and devour everything in his path. His jaws were said to stretch from earth to sky, consuming gods as easily as men. At the same time, Jörmungandr, coiled around Midgard, would rise from the sea, flooding the land and poisoning the sky with his breath. From the underworld would march the dead, led by Hel, while giants would storm the heavens, crossing shattered boundaries that once kept reality intact. Even the sun and moon would not escape. They would be devoured, plunging the world into darkness. The gods did not misunderstand Ragnarok. They knew exactly what it meant. Defeat, not a close battle, not a tragic victory, an absolute end. Odin would be swallowed by Fenrir. Thor would kill the world serpent only to collapse, poisoned, moments later. No sacrifice, no wisdom, no strength could prevent this outcome. What makes Ragnarok remarkable is not its destruction, but the response to it. The gods did not flee. They did not beg fate for mercy. They armed themselves, gathered their allies, and marched toward a battle they knew they would lose. To the Vikings, Ragnarok was not a failure of the gods. It was the ultimate proof of honor. Knowing the end did not excuse inaction. Meaning came from resistance, not survival. The universe would burn, but it would burn standing. In the Norse worldview, death was not a mystery to be feared. It was a destination already accounted for. The universe was built with endings in mind, and death was simply one more transition along Yggdrasil's branches. What mattered was not avoiding death, but earning the right kind of ending. The most famous destination was Valhalla, Odin's great hall. But Valhalla was never meant for everyone. It was reserved for those who died bravely in battle, weapon in hand, meeting violence with defiance. Even then, Valhalla was not rest. The dead warriors, the Einherjar, fought each other every day, killing and being killed, only to rise again by nightfall to feast and prepare. Death was not the end of struggle, it was recruitment. Alongside Valhalla existed Folkvanga, ruled by Freyja. Half of the fallen were said to go there instead. though little was known about what awaited them. This uncertainty mattered. The Vikings did not obsess over mapping the afterlife. They accepted that not everything was meant to be understood. For those who did not die in battle, there was hell. Contrary to later Christian ideas, hell was not a place of punishment. It was quiet, cold, and colourless, a reflection of deaths without glory. Farmers, children, the elderly, and the sick all ended there. Their fate was not shameful, just unremarkable. The Vikings did not see hell as evil. They saw it as absence. This belief system created a stark moral hierarchy. Glory was earned through action, not goodness. A kind man who died quietly might be loved, but he would not be celebrated. A violent man who faced death unflinching would be remembered. Memory mattered more than morality. Death rituals reflected this mindset. The dead were buried with weapons, tools, and symbols of identity, not because they would use them, but because they defined who the person was. To die stripped of your story was worse than dying violently. In the end, Norse belief did not promise justice after death. It promised recognition. You would not be judged, you would be remembered or forgotten. To the Vikings, dying well meant meeting the inevitable with dignity. The universe would end. Life would end. But how you faced that ending would echo longer than your breath ever could. Even after the destruction of Ragnarok, Norse mythology did not end in silence. When the flames died down and the seas withdrew, the universe was not erased, it was transformed. This final belief reveals something crucial about how the Vikings understood existence. Destruction was never absolute. It was a passage, not a conclusion. After Ragnarok, the world was said to rise again from the waters, cleansed but scarred. The earth would become green once more. Crops would grow without being sown. The sky would clear. This was not a return to innocence. It was survival after catastrophe. The new world carried memory, not forgetfulness. Some gods would endure. Balder, whose unjust death helped trigger the end, would return from the underworld, symbolizing renewal and restored balance. His presence did not undo the past, but it softened it. Light returned not because darkness was defeated, but because it had already done its worst. A new generation of gods would walk the renewed world, inheriting ruins instead of palaces. They would remember the mistakes of their predecessors. Wisdom would come not from prophecy, but from experience. The universe would continue, but it would continue humbler. Humanity would survive as well. Two figures, Leif and Lifthrasir, would hide during Ragnarok and emerge afterward to repopulate the world. Their survival was not heroic or glorious. It was quiet. This mattered. The Vikings understood that most survival does not look like legend. It looks like endurance in obscurity. This rebirth reshaped how the Vikings viewed struggle. Ragnarok was not a warning to behave better. It was proof that collapse was natural. Civilizations fall. Gods die. Worlds burn. And yet, life returns. Importantly, the reborn world was not guaranteed to be better. It was simply another chance. Norse mythology did not promise perfection after destruction, only continuation. The cycle could begin again, with new conflicts, new failures, and new endings waiting somewhere ahead. This belief made Norse cosmology profoundly different from later religious systems. There was no final victory, no eternal peace, just survival, memory, and repetition. And the Vikings lived knowing that even the end of everything was not the end of meaning. If something could rise again after total ruin, then enduring hardship, even briefly, was never pointless. The fire would come, but so would the world that followed. For the Vikings, Norse mythology was not distant myth or abstract theology. It was a lived reality. The cosmos of Yggdrasil, the gods, the giants, fate and Ragnarok were not stories told for comfort. They were explanations for why life felt harsh, unpredictable, and temporary. The universe made sense precisely because it did not promise fairness. Living inside this cosmic framework shaped how the Vikings understood themselves. They did not see humans as insignificant, but they did not see them as special either. Humans occupied Midgard, one branch among many, exposed to the same dangers that threatened gods and monsters alike. Storms, disease, hunger, and war were not punishments. They were simply expressions of a universe in constant tension. This worldview produced a distinct mindset. If suffering was inevitable, then dignity mattered more than comfort. If the end was written, then action mattered more than outcome. A man was judged not by success, but by resolve. Fear was understandable, but surrender was shameful. Norse mythology also rejected the idea of moral reward built into the universe. There was no guarantee that good people would thrive or evil people would fall. The gods themselves cheated, lied, and failed. What separated heroes from cowards was not virtue, but response. How you met hardship defined you more than the hardship itself. Even daily life reflected this cosmic logic. Feasting mattered because famine was always close. Loyalty mattered because betrayal was always possible. Reputation mattered because memory was the closest thing to immortality. To be remembered was to resist oblivion, even briefly. Importantly, this belief system did not produce despair. It produced resilience. Knowing that even the gods would die did not weaken faith. It strengthened resolve. If Odin himself could not escape fate, then humans had no reason to feel humiliated by loss. Struggle became a shared condition across all levels of existence. Norse mythology offered no escape from reality, but it offered alignment with it. The universe was brutal, so humans were expected to be brave. The future was uncertain, so preparation mattered. The end was guaranteed, so meaning had to be created now. To live as a Viking was to stand inside a collapsing cosmos and choose to act anyway. Not because victory was assured, not because salvation awaited, but because facing the storm head-on was the only honourable way to exist beneath the branches of the world tree. For most of human history, the face was something you never truly saw. You could feel it in the cold, sense it when others stared back at you, recognize it through pain, scars, and expressions. But you could not confront it directly. Identity existed without confirmation. You were a presence in the world, but your own image remained largely unknown. The earliest encounters with the self came by accident. A still pond at dawn, a dark pool after rain, a calm river that briefly stopped moving. For a moment, a face appeared, ghost-like, distorted, trembling with every breath of wind. Then it vanished. The image was never stable, never obedient. Water refused to hold the self in place. To early humans, this made reflection feel uncanny, almost supernatural. Seeing yourself was not a tool. It was an event. This absence mattered deeply. Without a fixed reflection, the sense of self was built outward, not inward. You knew who you were because of your role, your name, your lineage, your actions. Identity lived in memory and reputation, not in appearance. The body was functional, not aesthetic. It hunted, laboured, healed, aged. It was not examined. This may be why so many early cultures associated reflections with spirits, souls, or other worlds. A face appearing in water felt less like confirmation and more like intrusion. Was that truly you, or something wearing your shape? In many traditions, reflections were treated cautiously, even fearfully. Looking too long could mean inviting something back with you. Importantly, the lack of mirrors meant there was no daily confrontation with flaws, no studying symmetry, no measuring youth against decay. Wrinkles arrived unnoticed. Scars became familiar through touch, not sight. Aging happened quietly. Vanity, as we understand it today, had little room to grow. This did not make early humans less self-aware. It made them differently aware. The self was experienced through action, not observation. Through endurance, not appearance. Through story, not image. The invention of the mirror would shatter this balance. But before polished stone or shining metal ever returned a stable face, humanity lived for thousands of years without knowing exactly what it looked like. And in that long stretch of time, the self was something you were, never something you stared at. The first deliberate mirrors were not made of glass or metal. They were born from stone, dark, volcanic, and sharp. Polished obsidian, used as early as 6,000 years ago, offered humanity its first reliable way to see itself without distortion. For the first time, reflection became intentional. Unlike water, obsidian did not ripple. It did not disappear when touched. It held the face steady. This alone was revolutionary. A human could now stand still and watch themselves remain. The image was dark, dim, and imperfect, but it was recognizably human. But these mirrors were rare and powerful objects. Obsidian had to be mined, shaped, and carefully polished. Not everyone owned one. In many societies, mirrors were tied to ritual, status, and authority. To look into one was not casual, it was meaningful. Reflection was something you prepared for. Psychologically, this changed everything. The moment a person saw their own face clearly, they gained distance from themselves. You were no longer only inside your body, you could observe it. This created a split that had never fully existed before: the observer and the observed. The self became something you could inspect. This likely felt unsettling. Early mirror users were not trained to interpret their own appearance. Seeing your face reversed, staring back silently, may have felt confrontational or even threatening. Many cultures treated mirrors as spiritual tools, portals, or objects capable of holding souls. Breaking a mirror was not just damage, it was danger. Obsidian mirrors were often used in ceremonies, divination, and burial rites. They were associated with truth, but also with otherworldliness. The dark surface did not flatter. It did not shine brightly. It absorbed light, giving reflections a shadowed, almost dreamlike quality. Seeing yourself in obsidian was less about beauty and more about recognition. For the first time, humans could notice asymmetry. One eye slightly higher. A scar shaped differently than remembered. Facial expressions seen rather than felt. This introduced a new kind of self-awareness, visual self-awareness, and with it came the earliest seeds of self-consciousness. Once the face could be studied, it could be judged. Once it could be judged, it could be compared. Obsidian mirrors did not just show people who they were. They quietly introduced the idea that the self could be evaluated from the outside. As societies learned to shape metal, mirrors evolved from dark stone into shining bronze. These new mirrors reflected more light, more detail, and more authority. Unlike obsidian, bronze mirrors were bright, deliberate, and unmistakably human-made. They did not feel mystical in the same way. They felt controlled. Bronze mirrors first appeared in ancient civilizations across Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and the Mediterranean world. They were expensive, fragile, and difficult to maintain. Polishing was constant. Tarnish was inevitable. Owning a mirror now meant labor, time spent preserving your own reflection. This alone turned mirrors into symbols of status. Most people still lived their entire lives without ever seeing their own face clearly. Mirrors belonged to elites, priests, nobles, rulers. Reflection became selective. Who got to see themselves, and how often, was tied directly to power. To know your face was, in a sense, a privilege. Psychologically, bronze mirrors introduced something new: image management. Unlike obsidian, bronze offered clarity. Expressions were readable, features sharper. The face became something that could be adjusted. Hair could be arranged. Jewelry placed intentionally. The body began to be curated, not just inhabited. This mattered deeply in hierarchical societies. Rulers understood that appearance communicated authority. A controlled face suggested control over the world. Calm expressions signaled dominance. Mirrors allowed elites to rehearse themselves, to align their outward image with the role they needed to play. At the same time, Bronze mirrors quietly intensified self-scrutiny. The brighter the reflection, the harder it was to ignore flaws. Lines, scars, asymmetries, all became visible. The mirror did not just show who you were, it showed how you might be seen by others. The self became public, even in private. Many cultures responded with ritual boundaries. Mirrors were covered when not in use. Reflections were avoided at night. Looking too long was discouraged. These were not superstitions without reason. They were psychological safeguards. The human mind was still adapting to the shock of seeing itself so clearly. Bronze mirrors also reinforced gender roles. Women, in particular, were increasingly associated with reflection, grooming, and appearance. The mirror became a tool of expectation as much as self-knowledge. To be seen was to be judged. To prepare was to survive socially. With bronze, the mirror stopped being a rare confrontation and became a tool of identity maintenance. The self was no longer just discovered. It was maintained. The invention of glass mirrors transformed reflection from a privilege into a habit. Unlike obsidian or bronze, glass did not darken the face or distort it through uneven polish. It returned an image that felt precise, stable, and unforgiving. For the first time, humans could see themselves as others, likely saw them, clearly, repeatedly, and without ceremony. Early glass mirrors were still rare, but once production techniques improved, reflections slowly moved into daily life. Homes, workshops, and later public spaces began to contain mirrors. The self was no longer encountered occasionally. It was encountered constantly. This repetition changed the human mind. With glass mirrors came accuracy. Pores, wrinkles, and minute expressions became visible. There was no shadow to hide behind, no blur to soften the image. The face stopped being symbolic and became anatomical. People began to recognize themselves not just as roles or reputations, but as visible objects in the world. This precision intensified self-awareness into self-monitoring. You could now check your appearance at will, adjust posture, practice expressions, smile until it looked convincing, frown to see how it landed. The mirror became a rehearsal space for social interaction. Identity became something you could practice before presenting it. Psychologically, this marked a major shift. The self was no longer something that emerged through experience alone. It was something managed through observation. The internal sense of who you were began to compete with the external image staring back at you. For some, this created control. For others, anxiety. Glass mirrors also changed how time was experienced. Aging, once gradual and easy to ignore, became visible day by day. A new line here, a sag there. The mirror introduced comparison, not only with others, but with your past self. Memory gained a visual rival. Importantly, mirrors did not simply reveal reality, they standardized it. A normal face began to exist. Symmetry became desirable. Deviations became noticeable. Beauty standards, once fluid and cultural, started to harden around what the mirror consistently showed. The mirror was no longer neutral. It became an authority. This did not happen because glass mirrors were cruel, but because they were consistent. They showed the same face every day, whether you felt strong or weak, confident or afraid. They offered no emotional filter. With glass, humanity crossed a threshold. The self became something that could be observed, corrected, compared, and perfected. And once reflection became precise, it became impossible to unsee. Once mirrors became common, something subtle but profound happened inside the human mind. People began to live with a constant double, the self that acted and the self that watched. This division did not require philosophy or education. It emerged naturally the moment reflection became routine. Before mirrors, self-awareness was mostly internal. You felt embarrassment, pride, confidence, or shame without seeing yourself express it. With mirrors, emotion gained a visual component. You could now watch yourself being afraid. Watch yourself smile. Watch yourself age. The mind learned to step outside the body and look back in. This created a new psychological tension. The person you felt yourself to be did not always match the person you saw. Someone might feel strong, but look tired, feel confident but see hesitation in their eyes. The mirror exposed discrepancies between inner identity and outer appearance, forcing the brain to reconcile the two. Over time, this trained people to anticipate how they appeared, even when no mirror was present. You began to imagine yourself from the outside. How am I standing? How do I look when I speak? What expression am I wearing right now? The mirror no longer needed to be physically present. It had been internalized. This was a turning point in human psychology. Self-surveillance became normal. Behavior was adjusted not just by rules or fear of punishment, but by imagined observation. The mirror taught people to see themselves as objects in a social space. This had advantages. It allowed empathy to grow. If you could imagine how you looked, you could imagine how others felt. Social awareness improved. Communication became more refined. But it also came with a cost. The mirror made comparison unavoidable. Once you could see yourself clearly, you could compare yourself to others just as clearly. Beauty, youth, strength, and symmetry became measurable in ways they never had been before. The mind began ranking the self, sometimes harshly. Importantly, mirrors did not create insecurity out of nothing. They amplified it. They gave form to doubts that had once been vague. A feeling of not being enough could now attach itself to a visible detail. Over time, this split, the lived self and the observed self, became a permanent feature of human consciousness. You were no longer just being. You were watching yourself be. The mirror did not invent self-judgment. It gave it a face to focus on. As mirrors became embedded in daily life, they gained symbolic weight far beyond their physical function. Across cultures, mirrors came to represent truth, but not a comforting one. They were believed to reveal what could not be hidden, not only on the surface but beneath it. The reflection was honest, silent, and impossible to argue with. This is why mirrors became linked to superstition, fear, and taboo. Many societies believed mirrors could trap souls, invite spirits, or expose inner corruption. Looking too long was said to be dangerous. Covering mirrors after death became common practice, not just to prevent bad luck, but to protect the living from confronting absence too directly. A reflection in a house of mourning felt wrong, too alive. Psychologically, this fear makes sense. A mirror does not react, it does not reassure, it simply returns what is presented to it. This can feel unsettling because humans are wired to read intention in faces. A face that looks back without emotion breaks that expectation. It feels inhuman. Mirrors also forced confrontation with change. You could lie to yourself about who you were becoming, but the mirror could not. Each day, it quietly documented decline, growth, stress, or exhaustion. This gave mirrors a reputation for cruelty, even though they were doing nothing more than recording time. In religious and philosophical traditions, mirrors became tools for self-examination. To look at yourself was to face truth stripped of narrative. No story, no excuse, just presence. Some embraced this, others avoided it. The mirror became a test. Interestingly, mirrors were rarely treated as neutral objects. They were decorated, framed, ritualized, or hidden. Humans tried to soften the psychological impact by controlling the context in which reflection occurred. Even today, lighting and angles matter. We instinctively manipulate mirrors to manage how much truth we receive. Mirrors also created anxiety around identity. If your reflection changed, did that mean you had changed? Or had you always been that way, only now noticing? The mirror introduced doubt into self-perception. The self was no longer stable. It was observable and therefore questionable. This tension made mirrors powerful narrative devices in myth and storytelling. They revealed monsters, truths, curses, and transformations, not because they caused change, but because they revealed it. The fear surrounding mirrors was never really about superstition. It was about being seen by something that could not be persuaded, negotiated with, or fooled. As mirrors became more widespread, They quietly shifted from tools of awareness into tools of discipline. Reflection stopped being something you encountered occasionally and became something built into daily routines. You did not just see yourself, you checked yourself. This is where the mirror began to shape behavior before it happened. You adjusted posture preemptively. You softened expressions. You corrected habits not because someone else was watching, but because you imagined how you would look if they were. The mirror trained anticipation. Over time, this created a powerful feedback loop. The body acted, the mirror reflected, the mind evaluated, and the body adjusted again. Identity became something constantly edited. The self was no longer static, it was a draft. This had profound social consequences. Norms of appearance hardened. Cleanliness, grooming, posture, facial expression, all became moralized. Looking put together implied discipline. Looking unkempt implied failure. The mirror helped turn appearance into evidence of character. Importantly, this control did not need authority figures to function. No ruler had to enforce it. The mirror did the work silently. Once standards were internalized, people enforced them on themselves. Shame became private. Correction became automatic. This is why mirrors flourished alongside urbanization and complex societies. Large populations require predictability. Mirrors helped produce it. When people monitored themselves, they behaved in more socially acceptable ways. The mirror became part of the machinery of order, but this also narrowed acceptable ways of being. Difference became more visible. Deviation became harder to ignore. Bodies that did not fit expectations were no longer just different, they were visibly different. The mirror did not create exclusion, but it made exclusion measurable. Psychologically, this intensified self-criticism. The mind learned to scan for flaws the way a guard scans for threats. Even in moments of rest, the internal mirror stayed active. You were never fully off stage. And yet, people also learned to use mirrors strategically. Performers, leaders, negotiators, anyone who needed to influence others, used reflection to craft presence. The mirror could train confidence as much as insecurity. It sharpened self-awareness into self-command. By this point, the mirror was no longer a passive object. It shaped posture, emotion, and behavior long before action occurred. Humans were not just seeing themselves, they were governing themselves through the image that stared back. At some point, the mirror stopped needing to be in the room at all. Its function had already moved inside the mind. People learned to picture themselves constantly, from angles they could never physically see. This was the final transformation of reflection. The mirror became internal. You began to imagine how you looked while speaking, walking, laughing, even while alone. The self was now accompanied by an invisible observer, always present, always evaluating. This was no longer about appearance alone. It extended to behavior, emotion, and thought. Am I acting correctly? Am I reacting the right way? Do I look like the person I believe myself to be? This internal mirror reshaped identity at its deepest level. Personality became performative, even in private. You did not just feel anger, you watched yourself feel it. You did not just experience joy, you assessed how it looked. Emotional life gained a second layer: observation. This brought clarity for some. Self-reflection allowed growth, restraint, and intentional change. You could notice harmful patterns and correct them. You could rehearse courage. You could become more than impulse. But it also carried a cost. When the observer never turns off, rest becomes difficult. Silence becomes crowded. Even solitude feels public. The mind loses its ability to simply be, without commentary. This is where the mirror's psychological power becomes most intense. The self splits again, not between body and image, but between experience and judgment. You are no longer just living moments. You are evaluating them in real time. Modern anxiety thrives here. The fear of being seen persists even when no one is watching. The internal mirror does not blink. It does not get tired. It does not forgive easily. It remembers old reflections and compares them to new ones. And yet, this inward turn also enables deep self-knowledge. Without the mirror, there is no introspection. Without introspection, there is no deliberate identity. The same tool that creates insecurity also creates consciousness. This is the paradox of reflection. The mirror fragments the self, but it also allows the self to be shaped intentionally. It can trap you in endless self-criticism, or it can offer awareness powerful enough to change behavior. By this stage, humanity no longer needed polished stone, metal, or glass to see itself. The mirror had become a permanent feature of the human mind, watching, questioning, and defining who we believe ourselves to be. The invention of the mirror gave humanity something no other tool ever had: the ability to confront the self directly and repeatedly. It did not add strength, speed, or survival skills. It added awareness, and awareness changed everything. Once humans could see themselves clearly, identity became something visible. The self could be examined, improved, doubted, and reshaped. This brought growth. It allowed empathy, self-correction, and intention. People could align how they felt with how they appeared. They could become deliberate versions of themselves. But this gift came with a cost. Seeing yourself meant judging yourself, remembering yourself, comparing yourself. The mirror made the self measurable, and measurement invites hierarchy. Beauty, youth, and symmetry became currencies. Aging became something to track instead of accept. Difference became something to explain or hide. The mirror did not invent insecurity, vanity, or shame, but it gave them a fixed reference point. Doubt gained a surface. Fear gained a face. The self became both subject and object, actor and audience. This tension is still unresolved. Modern life is saturated with reflections, literal and digital. Screens, cameras, and profiles extend the mirror endlessly. The question introduced by the first polished stone has never gone away. Who am I, really? The one I feel myself to be, or the one I see? The mirror offers no answer. It never did. It only shows. And yet without it, much of what we call selfhood would not exist. The ability to recognize yourself is the foundation of responsibility, memory, and choice. The mirror fractured the self, but it also made it conscious. In the end, the invention of the mirror did not simply allow humans to see their faces. It forced them to live with themselves as visible beings in the world. To be human now means to carry that reflection everywhere, sometimes as insight, sometimes as burden. The mirror remains what it always was: silent, precise, and indifferent. It does not tell you who you are. It only asks you to look. By the late Renaissance, Italy was saturated with beauty, and restless because of it. Painting had reached astonishing realism. Architecture had learned to command space and emotion. Poetry could shape entire worlds with language alone. Yet music, for all its sophistication, still hovered on the edges of storytelling. It enhanced moments, but it did not yet carry them. Music existed everywhere, but rarely at the centre. In churches, it elevated prayer. In courts, it flattered power. In streets and taverns, it entertained. What it did not do, at least not fully, was sustain drama. Characters did not live and change through music. Stories were spoken or sung, but never truly embodied by sound. At the same time, Italian thinkers were gripped by a powerful idea: that the ancient Greeks had once achieved something greater. Scholars believed that Greek tragedy had united poetry, music, and performance into a single, overwhelming experience. Not background music, not decorative song, but voices carrying emotion, narrative, and meaning together. This belief mattered more than historical accuracy. What mattered was the longing it created. Renaissance intellectuals did not just want to study the past, they wanted to revive it. They imagined ancient audiences moved to tears by sung drama, their emotions guided by melody as much as by words. Italy was uniquely prepared for this experiment. City-states like Florence, Venice, and Mantua were wealthy, competitive, and obsessed with cultural prestige. Patrons wanted novelty, artists wanted freedom, philosophers wanted proof that art could shape the human soul. There was also a quiet frustration with existing music. Polyphony, multiple voices weaving together, was technically brilliant but emotionally confusing. Words were often lost in complexity, meaning dissolved into sound. If music was going to tell stories, something had to change. The stage was set not by one invention, but by dissatisfaction. A sense that art had gone as far as it could within its existing boundaries. A feeling that emotion needed clearer expression. That music needed to speak directly, not ornamentally. Opera was not born from excess confidence. It was born from a question. What if music stopped decorating stories and started being the story? That question would reshape Western music forever. The city where this question began to take shape was Florence. Not because it was quieter or more conservative, but because it was bold enough to experiment. Florence had long seen itself as a laboratory for culture, a place where art was not just admired, but engineered. If a new form was going to be invented, it would happen here. At the centre of this experimentation was a small group of poets, musicians, and philosophers who met in private homes rather than public theatres. They were later called the Florentine Camerata. What united them was not a shared style, but a shared frustration. They believed contemporary music had become too complex, too tangled in technical display to express genuine human emotion. Their core idea was radical for its time. Music should serve the words, not overpower them. They argued that ancient Greek drama had been sung in a simple speech-like style, where melody followed natural language. Whether this was historically true mattered less than the conviction behind it. They wanted music that spoke. This was dangerous territory. Renaissance music prized polyphony, the interweaving of multiple independent vocal lines. It was mathematically elegant, intellectually impressive, and deeply respected. To suggest abandoning it was to challenge centuries of tradition. Yet the Camerata pushed forward anyway. They imagined a new vocal style where a single voice carried the text clearly, supported by minimal harmony. This approach would allow listeners to understand every word, every emotional shift. Music would no longer blur meaning, it would sharpen it. What they were proposing was not just a technical change, it was a philosophical one. They believed emotion was central to art, and that art's purpose was to move the listener's inner state. If music failed to do that, no amount of complexity could redeem it. This idea reframed the role of the performer. Singers were no longer just voices within a texture. They became characters, individuals, bearers of narrative weight. The audience, in turn, was invited to listen differently, not for cleverness, but for feeling. Florence provided the perfect environment for such a risky experiment. Wealthy patrons funded trials. Small audiences tolerated failure. Artists were encouraged to test ideas rather than repeat formulas. The Florentine Camerata did not set out to invent opera as a genre. They set out to solve a problem, and in doing so, they opened a door that could never be closed again. Ideas alone were not enough. If music was truly going to become drama, someone had to risk putting theory on a stage. That step was taken at the very end of the 16th century, when composers began creating works that sat uneasily between music, speech, and theatre, things that did not yet have a name. One of the first to attempt this was Jacopo Peri, a musician working in Florence under noble patronage. Peri was not trying to invent a spectacle. He was trying to test an idea. Could a single voice, shaped like heightened speech, carry an entire story? The result was something new and strange. Instead of multiple voices intertwining, one character sang at a time. The melody followed the natural rise and fall of spoken Italian, stretching certain syllables, tightening others. This style came to be known as recitative, not fully song, not fully speech, but something suspended between the two. Early audiences did not hear these works as polished masterpieces. They heard them as experiments. The music was sparse, the accompaniment minimal, the drama intimate. But something unprecedented was happening. Characters were no longer pausing the story to sing. They were singing the story itself. This solved a major problem. Words could finally be understood. Emotion could unfold in real time. Music stopped interrupting drama and began serving it. A character's hesitation, grief, or anger could now stretch across musical time instead of being spoken and forgotten. These early operas often drew on mythological subjects, especially Greek stories. This was intentional. Myth provided emotional weight without requiring realism. Audiences already knew the endings. The focus was not suspense, but expression, how it felt to move toward fate. Importantly, these first works were not written for large public theatres. They were performed in courts and private spaces, for educated listeners who were willing to listen carefully. Opera began not as popular entertainment, but as intellectual art. There were doubts. Some found the style monotonous. Others missed the richness of polyphony. But even critics sensed something irreversible had begun. Once music learned how to speak clearly, it could no longer go back to being decorative alone. These early experiments were fragile, imperfect, and limited, but they proved one essential thing. A human voice, given enough space and intention, could carry an entire world. The early experiments proved that sung drama was possible. What they had not yet proven was that it could be powerful. That transformation came with Claudio Monteverdi, the composer who turned a fragile concept into a living art form. Monteverdi understood something his predecessors only sensed. If opera was going to survive, it could not remain an academic experiment. It had to move people. Emotion had to come first, even if rules were broken along the way. Where earlier composers had treated music cautiously, Monteverdi treated it like a weapon, bending harmony, rhythm, and melody to serve feeling. His operas did not merely present stories. They breathed. Characters argued, begged, raged, and collapsed emotionally, and the music followed them without restraint. Dissonance was no longer a flaw. It became a tool. When a character suffered, the harmony suffered with them. When desire surged, the music stretched beyond polite boundaries. Monteverdi also expanded the orchestra's role. Instruments were no longer just support. They became emotional commentators, colouring scenes with tension, tenderness, or dread. Silence itself became meaningful. A pause could wound as deeply as a note. This shift changed how audiences experienced opera. They were no longer listening politely. They were being pulled into the inner lives of characters. Mythological figures stopped feeling distant and symbolic. They became recognizably human, capable of jealousy, fear, regret, and longing. Crucially, Monteverdi proved that clarity and richness could coexist. Words remained intelligible, but the musical world around them grew deep and expressive. Opera no longer had to choose between intellect and emotion. It could command both. This was the turning point. After Monteverdi, opera was no longer a question mark. It was a viable, compelling form capable of growth. Composers across Italy took notice. Courts requested new works. Experiments became expectations. Opera also began to loosen its elite grip. While still expensive and exclusive, it was no longer confined to philosophical circles. Its emotional power made it accessible even to listeners who did not understand its theoretical origins. What Monteverdi achieved was not perfection, but momentum. He showed that opera could evolve, absorb influences, and deepen over time. Once audiences had felt music think, desire, and suffer on stage, there was no returning to simpler forms. Opera was alive now, and living things do not stay contained for long. Once opera proved it could move hearts, it needed a new home. one less restricted than princely courts and private salons. That home became Venice, a city unlike any other in Italy. Venice was wealthy, crowded, theatrical by nature, and most importantly, public. Here, opera would change forever. In Venice, opera left the world of exclusive patronage and entered the marketplace. Public opera houses began to appear, funded not by a single ruler, but by ticket sales. This single shift transformed the art form. For the first time, opera had to appeal not just to elites, but to paying audiences with varied tastes and expectations. This changed what stories were told and how they were told. Mythological subjects remained popular, but they were reshaped for drama, spectacle, and emotional immediacy. Plots became more complex. Characters became more extreme. Love, betrayal, disguise, jealousy, and revenge dominated the stage. Opera leaned into excess, because excess sold. Music adapted accordingly. Recitative still carried the story forward, but arias grew in importance. These moments allowed characters to pause the action and explore emotion in depth. The audience came to expect them. Singers became stars, admired not just for their voices, but for their personalities and expressive power. Venice also transformed staging. Opera houses invested in elaborate sets, moving scenery and visual effects. Gods descended from above. Palaces collapsed. Storms erupted indoors. Opera became a total sensory experience, combining sound, sight, and narrative into something overwhelming. This commercialization worried some intellectuals. They feared opera was becoming shallow, driven by spectacle rather than philosophy. But what they overlooked was that opera was doing exactly what living art does, adapting to its environment. Public audiences demanded clarity, emotion, and excitement. Opera responded by sharpening its tools. Music became more direct, characters more relatable, conflict more intense. The art form grew stronger, not weaker. Venice proved that opera did not need protection to survive. It needed engagement. When people paid to hear stories sung, those stories gained urgency. Opera stopped being an experiment and became a cultural force. By opening its doors to the public, opera gained something crucial. A voice that belonged not just to artists or patrons, but to society itself. As opera spread across Italy, the human voice itself became the central battlefield. Composers were no longer satisfied with simply telling stories through music. They wanted voices that could astonish, overwhelm, and suspend time. This hunger for intensity pushed singing into unfamiliar territory. Opera demanded extremes, long phrases without breath, sudden leaps across wide ranges, sustained notes that seemed to defy the limits of the body. The voice was treated not just as a natural instrument, but as something to be trained, stretched, and disciplined into submission. This gave rise to a new kind of performer, the virtuoso singer. Technique became spectacle. Audiences came not only for stories, but to witness vocal feats that bordered on the impossible. A single aria could stop the drama entirely, holding listeners in place through sheer sonic force. Nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of the castrati. Male singers altered before puberty to preserve high voices with adult lung power. Their voices were unlike anything else, powerful, flexible, and eerily pure. To modern ears, the practice feels brutal. To 17th century audiences, it felt miraculous. Castrati became stars. They commanded enormous fees, inspired devotion, and shaped how composers wrote music. Roles were designed around their abilities. Emotional expression became inseparable from vocal display. Grief, love, rage, and triumph were all measured through sound pushed to its limits. This focus on vocal power changed opera's emotional language. Feelings were no longer just expressed, they were prolonged, magnified, and explored in detail. An aria could stretch a single emotion across minutes, forcing the audience to sit inside it. Opera taught listeners how to endure feeling, not just recognize it. At the same time, this emphasis created tension. Critics worried that spectacle was overtaking story, that singers were becoming more important than characters. That technique threatened to overshadow meaning. These debates would never fully disappear, but they were signs of growth, not decay. Opera had discovered something fundamental. The human voice, when disciplined and unleashed, could carry emotion more directly than any instrument. It bypassed intellect and went straight to the body. By pushing voices beyond ordinary limits, opera expanded the emotional range of art itself. It asked not just what stories could be told, but how much feeling a human being could be made to contain and release through breath alone. As opera matured, its freedom began to demand structure. The early years had been experimental, even chaotic, but widespread popularity created new pressures. Audiences wanted clarity, singers wanted showcases, composers needed balance. Out of this tension emerged a more defined dramatic architecture. Opera began to separate its emotional functions. Recitative carried the plot forward quickly and efficiently. Arias paused time. In these moments, action stopped so feeling could deepen. A decision already made was examined from every emotional angle. Desire lingered. Regret expanded. Triumph unfolded slowly. This rhythm, movement followed by reflection, became opera's heartbeat. This structure shaped how stories were written. Librettists learned to design scenes around emotional peaks. Conflict had to justify an aria. Characters were built not only through action, but through how they sounded when isolated in emotion. Identity became musical. Different cities favoured different balances. In places like Naples, opera leaned toward vocal brilliance and formal beauty. Drama served the music. In other centres, emotional realism carried more weight. These regional styles competed, borrowing from one another, refining the form through rivalry. Opera also developed clearer character types. Heroes, lovers, villains, and rulers gained recognizable musical languages. Certain rhythms suggested authority. Certain melodic shapes implied vulnerability. Audiences learned to read these signals instinctively. Music became narrative shorthand. Importantly, this growing order did not eliminate intensity. It focused it. By containing emotion within formal boundaries, opera made it more powerful. A single aria, placed at the right moment, could resonate longer than constant musical motion ever could. This balance between control and excess mirrored broader cultural changes. Europe was organizing itself politically, socially, aesthetically. Opera reflected this shift. Passion was still celebrated, but it had to be framed, shaped, and delivered with precision. Some critics mourned the loss of early rawness, others welcomed the refinement. What mattered was that opera now had a language flexible enough to survive change. It could absorb new tastes without losing its core. By learning how to pace emotion, opera secured its future. It was no longer dependent on novelty or shock. It could build tension, release it, and leave audiences changed. The art form had found its shape. Now it only needed time to carry it forward. By the early 18th century, opera had outgrown the conditions that created it. What began as a specifically Italian solution to a Renaissance problem, how to fuse music and drama, had become something far larger. Opera was no longer an experiment. It was an export. Italian opera travelled with astonishing speed. Composers, singers, and impresarios moved from city to city, carrying scores, techniques, and expectations with them. Italian became the dominant language of opera, even in places where no one spoke it fluently. Audiences learned to feel emotion through sound before they understood the words. This spread changed opera's function. In Italy, opera had been a living conversation between philosophy, music, and society. Abroad, it became a symbol of refinement, power, and cultural prestige. Courts across Europe built opera houses not just for entertainment, but to signal sophistication. Hosting opera meant belonging to a larger cultural world. As opera crossed borders, it adapted. Local tastes reshaped it. Some regions favoured spectacle and grandeur, others demanded clearer storytelling or moral restraint. Yet Italian foundations remained visible everywhere: the emphasis on voice, the alternation of recitative and aria, the belief that music could embody emotion more truthfully than speech. This expansion also intensified debate. Was opera meant to impress or to move? Should singers dominate or should drama lead? These arguments followed opera wherever it went, but conflict did not weaken the form, it sharpened it. Each challenge forced composers to refine their approach. Italian opera's success revealed something important about human psychology. People did not need to understand every word to feel invested. The voice itself carried meaning. Tone, tension, breath, and silence communicated emotion directly. Opera proved that feeling could travel faster than language. At the same time, opera's spread marked a turning point in how art circulated. It was no longer bound to a single place or elite group. It moved through networks of theatres, patrons, and audiences. Opera became one of the first truly international art forms. Yet even as it transformed abroad, opera never fully severed itself from its Italian origins. The belief that music should serve drama, that voices should embody emotion, remained its core logic. No matter how ornate or restrained it became, opera carried this founding principle within it. What began in small Florentine rooms now echoed across continents. Opera had escaped its birthplace, but it never escaped the idea that gave it life, that human stories deserved voices large enough to contain them. The birth of opera in Italy was not the creation of a genre, so much as the creation of a new way of thinking about art. Before opera, music and drama existed beside each other. After opera, they became inseparable. Sound was no longer decoration, it became language. Opera proved that music could do more than accompany emotion. It could be emotion. A trembling phrase could replace a paragraph of dialogue. A held note could express indecision, desire, or despair more clearly than speech ever could. In doing so, opera changed how audiences understood truth on stage. Authenticity was no longer about realism, it was about emotional accuracy. This shift reshaped performers as well. Singers were not merely interpreters of notes. They became vessels of feeling, expected to merge technique with psychology. A convincing performance required more than a powerful voice. It required understanding why a character sang the way they did. Opera demanded that emotion be disciplined, not improvised. It also reshaped audiences. Listening became active. To follow an opera, you learned to read musical cues, to anticipate emotional turns, to sit inside extended moments of feeling. Opera trained patience. It asked listeners to stay with emotion longer than everyday life allowed. Most importantly, opera introduced a lasting idea, that art could heighten reality without escaping it. The stories were often mythical, exaggerated or implausible, but the emotions were recognizably human. Love hurt the same way. Loss sounded the same way. Fear tightened the breath the same way. Opera exaggerated form to reach truth. This is why opera endured long after the Renaissance questions that created it faded. Even when styles changed, languages shifted, and theatres evolved, the core impulse remained. Humans still wanted stories that felt larger than life, but truer than words alone. The birth of opera did not replace earlier art forms. It absorbed them, poetry, theatre, music, architecture, and fused them into a single experience. That fusion became its strength. In the end, opera succeeded because it answered a deep human need, to hear inner life made audible. When music learned to speak, it did not just create a new genre. It gave emotion a voice powerful enough to fill a room, a city, and eventually the world.